They said she was something to fear, but fear doesn't kneel in the dust and ask to be spared. The wind moved low across the desert, carrying the smell of dry earth and old smoke as Ethan Cole reined his horse to a stop just 30 feet away from her. The woman everyone had been talking about. The one with a price tied to her name like a noose waiting for a neck. And she didn't stand tall the way the stories claimed, didn't bare her teeth or reach for a weapon. Instead, she lowered herself slowly to her knees in the pale morning light, her shadow stretching long behind her like it didn't belong to her at all. And when she lifted her eyes to him, there was no fire there, no challenge, only something quieter, something that didn't fit the rumors. "Please, don't be afraid of me," she said, her voice steady but thin, like it had been worn down by too many miles and too many doors closed before she could knock. And Ethan felt the weight of every story he'd ever heard pressing against that moment. Every warning whispered over whiskey. Every name spoken with a shake of the head. Apache, dangerous, unpredictable, not like us. And yet none of those voices were standing here now. None of them were looking into her eyes. None of them were hearing the way her breath caught just slightly at the end of each word, like she wasn't sure she'd be allowed to finish speaking. His hand rested near his gun out of habit, not intent, the leather warm under his fingers from the rising sun. But he didn't draw, didn't even tighten his grip. Instead, he studied her the way a man studies a trail that doesn't make sense, slow, careful, searching for what didn't fit. She was taller than most women he'd seen, broad in the shoulders with a presence that should have filled the space between them with tension, but it didn't, not the way it should have. Her dark hair hung loose, tangled slightly from travel, and her clothes carried the dust of long miles. But there was something else too, something out of place. Her hands were open, palms facing him, empty, and not just empty of weapons, empty of intent, like she'd already given up whatever fight the world expected her to bring. Ethan shifted in the saddle, the leather creaking softly beneath him, his horse restless in a way that mirrored the thoughts moving through his mind. Because this wasn't how these encounters were supposed to go, not according to the men who talked too loud in town, not according to the posters nailed to wooden walls promising money for a name, $500 for Nayeli, wanted for the deaths of a settler family out near Red Creek. The kind of accusation that didn't need proof out here, just belief, and belief came easy when fear was involved. But Ethan had learned a long time ago that fear had a way of shaping things that weren't there, of turning shadows into threats and silence into guilt. And as he looked at her now, kneeling in the dust like she was the one being judged, something in him refused to match what he saw with what he'd been told. He swung his leg over and dismounted, boots hitting the ground with a dull thud that seemed louder than it should have been in the stillness between them. And for a moment, neither of them moved, the distance holding like a line drawn in the dirt, a line that had been there long before either of them arrived, a line built from stories, from loss, from things that couldn't be undone. "You don't look like someone people are afraid of," Ethan said finally, his voice calm, not accusing, not kind either, just honest in the way a man speaks when he's trying to understand something he doesn't have the words for yet. She let out a breath that almost sounded like a laugh, but didn't quite make it that far. "That's not what they see," she replied, and her eyes flickered downward for just a second before returning to his, like she was used to watching people turn away before she could say anything more. Ethan took a step closer then, slow enough that it wasn't a threat, steady enough that it wasn't hesitation, and the space between them shifted, just slightly, just enough to matter. The sun caught on something in her hand, something small she hadn't been hiding but hadn't offered either, and when he looked closer, he saw it clearly, a string of beads, darkened in places like they'd been touched by fire, worn smooth from years of being held. And there was something about them that felt familiar in a way he couldn't place right away, something that tugged at a memory just out of reach. She noticed his gaze and tightened her fingers around it for a moment before slowly opening her hand. Not as an offering, not yet, just enough for him to see. "I didn't do what they said," she said quietly, and it wasn't a plea for belief. It wasn't desperate. It was something else, something closer to resignation, like she'd said those words before and knew how they usually ended. Ethan didn't answer right away, not because he didn't have something to say, but because he understood that this moment wasn't about words, not yet. It was about what came before them, what stood between them, and whether either of them was willing to step across it. The wind shifted again, carrying a distant sound this time. Faint but unmistakable. Hoofbeats. More than one. Coming fast. And Ethan's eyes moved toward the horizon without turning his head, calculating distance. Time. Choices. The kind of thinking that had kept him alive this long. And when he looked back at her, she hadn't moved, hadn't run, hadn't even looked behind her, like she already knew what was coming and had decided something about it long before he arrived. You should go, she said softly, almost like she was telling him the sky was blue or the ground was dry. Something simple, something obvious, but he didn't move, didn't reach for his gun, didn't step back. Instead, he did the one thing that didn't belong in any of the stories he'd ever heard. He stepped closer, and in that single step, quiet and unremarkable to anyone else, the distance between them, every mile of it, every year of it, every lie built into it, began to change. The sound reached them fully now, no longer a whisper carried by wind, but a rhythm that pressed against the ground itself, steady and certain, closing the distance 1 second at a time, and Ethan did not turn his back on it, did not break his focus from Nayeli, because something in her stillness mattered more than whatever was coming over that ridge. You knew they were coming, he said, his voice low, not accusing, just placing a truth between them like a stone, and she gave the smallest nod, her fingers tightening again around the darkened beads before she let them rest open in her palm. They have been following me for 2 days, she said, and there was no fear in the way she spoke it now, only exhaustion, the kind that settles deeper than bone, the kind that does not leave when danger passes because it has already made a home inside you. Ethan glanced past her then, just briefly, measuring the land, the low rise of rock to the east, the narrow cut that could hide a man for a moment if he needed it, but he did not move toward it, did not suggest it, because she had not moved, and that choice meant something he was not ready to ignore. Most people would have run, he said, and she almost smiled again. Almost. Most people still believe running changes what is behind them, she replied, and that answer stayed with him longer than it should have, settling into a place he had not expected to open today. The hoofbeats grew louder, clearer now. He could count them without looking, 6 at least, maybe more. Behind them, the kind of number that turned a decision into something permanent, and he felt the weight of that decision pressing closer, not from the riders, but from the silence between him and her. That necklace, he said, nodding toward her hand. Where did you get it? And this time she did not hesitate. She lifted it slightly, enough for the light to catch the edges of the beads, enough for him to see the way the surface had been marked, not broken, not crushed, but changed by something. Hot and fast. I found it, she said, then added after a moment. At the place where they say the family died. And Ethan felt something shift in his chest, not a certainty, not yet, but a crack in the story he had been handed, because he had seen what fire did to things, had stood close enough to it once to know its patterns, and this was not that, this was something else, something that did not belong to the quiet burn of a cooking fire or the wild spread of a grass flame. You went back, he said, and she nodded again, slower this time. I wanted to understand why they chose me, she answered, and there it was, not denial, not defense, but a question turned inward, a question that had no easy place to rest. The riders came into view then, cresting the ridge in a line that broke the horizon into moving shapes, dust rising behind them like a second sky, their hats low, their posture certain, men who believed in what they were doing, or at least believed in the reward waiting at the end of it. Ethan watched them for a second longer than necessary, long enough to see the lead rider lift a hand, long enough to know they had already seen him, already marked him as part of whatever this was going to become. If I walk away now, he said quietly, not looking at her, they will not follow me. And it was not a question, it was a fact laid bare, simple, clean, the kind of truth a man builds a life around. And for a moment, nothing answered him, not the wind, not the approaching riders, not even his own thoughts. Then she spoke, softer than before. I know. And that was all. No plea, no attempt to hold him there, no reaching hand or desperate word, just acceptance. And somehow that made the space between them heavier than anything she could have said. Ethan exhaled slowly, the air leaving his lungs like it had been waiting to do so for years, and he took another step, closing what little distance remained until he stood just a few feet from her, close enough now to see the fine lines of dust across her skin, the way her shoulders held tension even in stillness, the way her eyes did not leave his even as. The sound behind them grew louder. "You are not what they think," he said, and it was not a declaration, not yet, more like a recognition forming as he spoke it. And she shook her head slightly, not in disagreement, but in something more complicated. "It does not matter what they think," she said. "It matters what they are willing to do because of it." And the truth of that settled into him with a weight he could not ignore, because he had seen that before too, had watched men act on stories that were easier than truth, had seen what belief could turn into when no one stood still long enough to question it. The riders were close now. Close enough that he could hear the creak of leather, the low murmur of voices carried ahead of them. And still she did not move. Still she knelt there with the beads resting in her hand like they were the only thing tying her to something real. "Stand up," Ethan said suddenly. And for the first time since he had met her, she hesitated, just for a heartbeat, as if the idea itself did not fit the moment. Then slowly, carefully, she rose to her feet, not towering over him the way the stories would have painted it, but standing equal, grounded, present. And he saw then that her strength had never been in her size, never in the way she could be described or feared. It was in this, in the way she stayed, in the way she faced what was coming without reaching for anything but truth. The riders pulled their horses to a stop a short distance away, dust settling around them in slow spirals. The lead man looking from Ethan to Naeli and back again, measuring, calculating, and Ethan did not reach for his gun, did not shift his stance into anything that resembled a threat. He simply stood there, between them and her, not blocking, not hiding, just present. And in that quiet, in that single choice to remain where he was, something unseen began to change, something that no one there had planned for, not the riders, not Naeli, not even Ethan himself. The silence held for a fraction longer than it should have, stretched thin between men who were used to quick conclusions and faster judgments. And the lead rider tilted his head slightly as he studied Ethan, not with anger, not yet, but with the kind of curiosity that comes when something does not follow the script you expected. "You lost, Cole," he called out, his voice carrying easy across the dry air, casual in a way that made the moment feel smaller than it was, like this was just another stop on a long day, just another decision that had already been made. Ethan did not answer right away, his eyes steady, his stance unchanged, and behind him, Naeli stood without shifting, her presence quiet but unhidden, like she had decided there would be no more running, no more shrinking into spaces that were not meant for her. "There is a bounty," the rider continued, guiding his horse a few steps closer, the others fanning out slightly behind him, not threatening, just certain. $500 says she does not walk away from here," he added, and there was a murmur among the men, not excitement, not cruelty, just agreement, the kind that comes from shared understanding, shared purpose, shared belief that what they were doing did not need to be questioned. Ethan let the words settle, let the number hang in the air like it meant something more than it did, because out here, money had a way of turning choices into something simple, something clean, but this did not feel simple, not with her standing behind him, not with that small string of darkened beads still resting in her hand, catching the light in a way that refused to be ignored. "You ever seen those before?" Ethan asked, his voice calm as he nodded slightly toward Naeli's hand, and the rider's gaze flickered there for just a moment before returning to Ethan, dismissive at first, then narrowing slightly as something registered, something small, something he could not quite place but did not like the feeling of. "Does it matter?" he replied, and Ethan took a slow breath. The kind a man takes when he is about to say something that might not change anything but still needs to be said. "It might," he answered, and then, without turning, without asking, he reached his hand back slightly, palm open, and for a moment, there was nothing, just the space between them, the choice resting there unspoken. And then Naeli moved, not stepping forward, not closing the distance, but placing the beads gently into his hand, her fingers brushing his only for an instant, light, careful, like even that contact carried weight. Ethan brought them up, turning them slightly so the sun could touch the surface, revealing the marks more clearly now, the edges darkened in uneven lines, not burned through, not destroyed, just altered in a way that told a story if you knew how to read it. This is not from a campfire, he said, his eyes still on the beads, not on the men. Not yet. This comes from something hotter, faster, something that does not sit and spread, something that moves. And there was a shift then, subtle but real, among the riders. A glance passed from one to another, not agreement this time, but uncertainty, the kind that creeps in when a story you have accepted without question starts to loosen at the edges. The lead rider's expression tightened, not angry, but focused now. You saying she did not do it? He asked, and the question hung there, heavier than the one before, because now it was not just about money, not just about a name on a poster. It was about the ground beneath that belief, whether it would hold or crack. Ethan finally looked up, meeting the man's eyes directly. I am saying there is more to it than what you have been told, he said, and his voice did not rise, did not push. It stayed level, steady, like he was offering something instead of taking it away, and that made it harder to dismiss, harder to ignore. Nayeli stood behind him, silent, not adding to his words, not correcting them, just letting them exist, and in that silence, there was something stronger than any argument she could have made, because it was not about convincing them. It was about standing in the truth long enough for it to be seen. One of the men shifted in his saddle, clearing his throat slightly. Towns said it was her. He muttered, not to Ethan, not to anyone in particular, just voicing the thought that had been enough before, and Ethan nodded once, slow. Towns says a lot of things, he replied, and there was no challenge in it. Just a quiet reminder that stories travel faster than truth out here. The lead rider exhaled. Through his nose, his grip on the reins tightening just a fraction, his confidence not gone, but no longer as easy as it had been when they first arrived. You standing in our way, Cole? He asked, and this time, there was something sharper beneath the words, not threat, not yet, but direction, a line being drawn where none had been before. Ethan did not move, did not step forward or back. He simply shifted his weight slightly, grounding himself in the dust beneath his boots. I am standing where I am, he said, and it was not defiance, not a challenge. It was a statement of fact, simple, unadorned, and somehow that made it harder to push against, because there was nothing to argue with, nothing to twist, just a man choosing not to move. The wind picked up again, carrying the dust in low swirls around their feet, blurring the edges of the moment, softening the lines that had been so clear just minutes before, and in that shifting air, something changed, not in a loud way, not in a way anyone could point to, but in the way the men held themselves, in the way their eyes moved between Ethan and Nayeli, no longer seeing just a target, no longer seeing just a reward, but something else, something they had not come prepared for, uncertainty, and it settled over them like a shadow that did not belong to the sun, quiet, persistent, waiting to see what would happen next. No one reached for anything, and that was the strangest part of it, not the dust, not the silence, not even the way a dozen armed men now sat unsure of what came next, but the absence of motion, like the world itself had paused just long enough to see who would move first, and Ethan could feel it in the air, that thin edge where decisions turned into consequences, where a man either stepped forward or stayed exactly where he stood, and the lead rider shifted slightly in his saddle, eyes narrowing again as if trying to force the moment back into something familiar, something easier to control. You always talk this much before you make a mistake, Cole, he said, and there was a faint trace of humor in it, but it did not land the way it might have earlier, not with the uncertainty already taking root among the others. Ethan rolled the beads once between his fingers, slow, deliberate, feeling the uneven surface, the subtle heat scar that did not belong to any story he had ever been told about Apache fires, and he let that silence answer first before he spoke. You ever notice how truth does not need to be loud? He said, his voice steady, almost quiet enough to miss if a man was not listening, and a few of the riders shifted again, glancing at each other, not because they agreed, but because they were no longer sure they disagreed, and that difference mattered. Nayeli remained still behind him, but not hidden, never hidden, her presence no longer something that needed protection as much as it needed recognition, and the lead rider exhaled slowly, his patience thinning in a way that was not anger yet, but moving toward it. "We are not here for stories," he replied. "We are here to finish what was started." And there it was again, that certainty, that belief in a line already drawn, and Ethan nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. "That is the problem," he said. "Something was started, just not by who you think." And this time the words landed heavier, not because of how they were said, but because of what they suggested, a crack widening just enough to let doubt breathe. One of the men toward the back leaned forward slightly, squinting at the beads in Ethan's hand. "Where did you say you found that?" he asked, his voice lower, less certain than before, and Nayeli answered before Ethan could, her voice calm, unshaken. "At Red Creek," she said, and the name settled over them like a memory no one wanted to revisit too closely. Because Red Creek was not just a place, it was a story already told, already believed, already passed from one town to another with the kind of finality that did not invite questions. But now, standing here, with the evidence turning slowly between Ethan's fingers, it did not feel as final as it had before. Fire moves different when it is pushed, Ethan added, lifting the beads slightly. Leaves marks like this, sharp, uneven, like it was not meant to stay in one place. And he did not need to say more, did not need to explain further, because men who lived out here understood fire the way they understood weather, the way they understood land, and they knew the difference between something that spread on its own and something that was driven, directed, used. The lead rider's jaw tightened slightly, his confidence now something he had to hold on to instead of something that came naturally. "You trying to tell me someone else did it?" he asked, and this time there was no humor left in his voice, only a need for the world to return to what he knew. Ethan met his gaze without hesitation. "I am telling you someone wanted it to look like she did," he said, and the truth of that did not come with certainty, not yet, but it came with enough weight to shift the ground beneath them. Nayeli's hand moved slightly at her side, not reaching for anything, not defensive, just a small motion that drew attention to the fact that she was still there, still present, still part of this moment that refused to follow the path it was supposed to take. "Why would anyone do that?" another rider asked, and the question came out quieter than the rest, almost reluctant, because asking it meant admitting there might be something worth knowing. Ethan let out a slow breath, his eyes flicking briefly toward the horizon before returning. "Same reason people always do," he said. "Fear is easier to sell than truth." And the words did not accuse, did not point fingers. They simply existed, and that made them harder to dismiss, harder to argue against, because each man there had seen it before in one way or another, had heard stories grow larger as they traveled, had watched facts bend into something more convenient. The wind picked up again, carrying the dust in slow arcs around them, softening the edges of the moment. And in that shifting air, the line between them blurred just slightly, no longer as clear as it had been when the riders first arrived. The lead man looked at Ethan for a long second, then passed him to Nayeli, and something in his expression changed, not fully, not enough to undo what had brought him here, but enough to pause, enough to hesitate, and that hesitation spread, quiet and unspoken, through the men behind him, because hesitation, once it begins, has a way of moving faster than certainty ever did. Ethan did not press, did not step forward, did not try to force the moment into anything more than it was. He simply stood there, the beads still in his hand, the truth still unspoken in full, but present enough to be felt. And in that stillness, something unexpected began to take shape. Not an ending, not yet, but the first real crack in a story that had been accepted too easily, too quickly, and for the first time since the riders appeared over that ridge. It was no longer clear who had come here to decide what would happen next. The air did not break, but it shifted, like something unseen had taken a step no one heard, and the men felt it before they understood it, that quiet weight, settling into their chests, not fear, not yet, but something closer to doubt, and doubt had a way of slowing a man's hand more than any threat ever could. The lead rider adjusted his grip on the reins again, his horse stamping once against the dry ground, impatient in a way its rider was not allowed to be. "You are asking us to walk away from $500 because of a story and a handful of burned beads," he said, and the words were meant to sound firm, meant to pull the moment back into something simple, something measured in money and certainty, but they did not land clean. not with the silence that followed, not with the way the other men were now looking at the ground instead of at Naeli. Ethan did not answer immediately. He turned the beads once more in his hand, then lowered them slightly, not hiding them, just letting them exist between all of them like a question that refused to leave. "I am asking you to look at what is in front of you," he said, and his voice carried no edge, no push, just presence, steady as the land beneath them. One of the riders near the back let out a slow breath, rubbing the side of his jaw like he was trying to work through something that had not been there before. "Town said there were tracks," the man muttered, "said they led straight into Apache land." And Ethan nodded once, not dismissing it, not agreeing either. "Tracks go where someone walks," he replied. "Does not mean they started there." And that answer did not settle things, but it did something else. It opened a space where answers were no longer fixed, where the path behind them could be questioned instead of accepted. Naeli shifted her weight slightly then, not stepping forward, not retreating, just grounding herself in the moment. And when she spoke, her voice did not rise, did not plead. It simply carried, clear and even. "They needed someone you would believe," she said. And the words moved through the group like a quiet wind, touching each man differently, because belief was not something they chose lightly, not out here. But once chosen, it was rarely challenged. The lead rider's eyes narrowed again, not in anger, but in something more complicated, something that did not sit well with him. "And you think we would believe you?" he asked, and there was a trace of something under it. Not mockery, not fully, but close. Naeli met his gaze without flinching. "No," she said, and that single word settled heavier than any argument she could have made, because it carried no expectation, no demand, only truth. And for a moment, no one spoke, the kind of silence that does not ask to be filled, that waits to see what a man will do with it. Ethan glanced at her then, just briefly, and there was something in that look that passed between them, not agreement, not understanding, but recognition, like two people standing on the same ground for the first time without needing to explain how they got there. The wind eased, the dust settling back into the earth as if even it was listening now. The lead rider looked over his shoulder at the men behind him, and for the first time since they had arrived, he did not see certainty reflected back at him. He saw hesitation, small, quiet, but present, and that changed the way he held himself, the way his shoulders set, the way his voice came out when he spoke again. "If this is not her doing," he said slowly, "then whose is it?" And the question did not demand an answer. It revealed a shift, a step away from what had been decided before they ever rode out here. Ethan exhaled through his nose, the sound barely audible. "That is the part no one wanted to look at," he said, and he let the words sit, did not rush to fill the space after them, because this was not a moment for answers, not yet. It was a moment for seeing, for letting the edges of a story fall away enough to notice what had been hidden beneath it. One of the younger riders shifted in his saddle, glancing again at Naeli, then at Ethan, then down at the ground. "If we turn back," he said quietly, "what do we tell them?" And there it was, not the money, not the hunt, but the weight of returning without certainty, without a clear ending. Ethan looked at him, steady, unshaken. "You tell them what you saw," he said, "not what they wanted you to see." And the simplicity of that landed deeper than anything else had, because it did not ask them to believe him, did not ask them to trust her. It asked them only to be honest with what stood in front of them. And that was a harder thing than any bounty. The lead rider's gaze moved once more between Ethan and Naeli, and something in his expression softened, not enough to call it understanding, not enough to call it trust, but enough to break the certainty that had brought him here. He shifted in his saddle again, slower this time, like the weight of the decision had changed shape. "You are asking us to leave without finishing it," he said, and Ethan shook his head slightly. "I am asking you not to finish something that was never started the way you think," he replied, and the difference between those two things hung there, quiet, undeniable. The men looked at one another again, not for direction, but for confirmation that they were all feeling the same shift, that something had changed in a way none of them had expected when they first saw her, kneeling in the dust, and in that shared hesitation, in that quiet agreement to pause instead of push forward, the moment turned, not loudly, not with any clear signal, but in the way a line disappears when no one chooses to stand on it anymore. And for the first time since the riders arrived, the outcome was no longer something waiting to happen. It was something being decided in real time, one man at a time, in the silence between what they believed and what they could no longer ignore. The moment did not end. It deepened, like the ground beneath them had shifted just enough that no one was standing where they thought they were anymore. And the lead rider looked down at his hands for a brief second before lifting his gaze again, not at Ethan this time, but at Nayeli, really looking at her for the first time since he had ridden over that ridge, not as a target, not as a name tied to a price, but as a person standing there without moving, without running, without asking for anything more than the chance to be seen as she was. And something in that stillness unsettled him in a way he could not easily dismiss. "Why did you not run?" he asked, and the question came out slower than his others, like it had not been planned, like it had found its way out on its own. Nayeli did not answer immediately. She glanced down once at the beads now resting in Ethan's hand, then back up, her expression unchanged, steady as the horizon behind her. "Because running does not change what they believe," she said, and her voice carried no bitterness, no edge, just a quiet certainty that came from knowing something too many times. And that answer lingered, not just with him, but with the others, because each of them had chased something before, had followed tracks across miles of land believing they were moving closer to the truth. And now they were being asked to consider that maybe they had only been moving deeper into something they did not fully understand. One of the riders shifted in his saddle again, this time more noticeably. If she wanted to hide, she would not be standing here, he muttered, almost to himself, and the man beside him nodded. Slightly, not agreeing fully, but no longer disagreeing either. And that small shift, that quiet alignment, began to spread, not loudly, not in any way that could be pointed to, but in the way their posture changed, the way their eyes moved, no longer fixed, no longer certain. Ethan watched it happen without saying anything, because this was not something words could force. It had to come on its own, had to settle in each man in its own time. The lead rider exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering just a fraction, the tension in his grip easing without him realizing it. "You are asking us to trust what we see here more than what we have been told," he said, and Ethan nodded once. Simple, direct, yes, he replied, and that single word carried more weight than anything else he could have added, because it placed the choice squarely in front of them, not as a demand, not as a challenge, but as something they had to decide for themselves. The wind moved again, softer now, carrying with it the faint scent of distant water, something rare in this stretch of land, something that reminded a man that not everything out here was dry and unyielding, that sometimes, if you looked long enough, there was something else beneath the surface. The lead rider looked over his shoulder once more, meeting the eyes of each man behind him. And this time, he did not see the same reflection he had seen before. He saw questions, he saw hesitation, and more importantly, he saw that none of them were ready to move forward the way they had planned, and that realization settled into him like a weight he could not ignore. "We came here to finish something," he said slowly, turning back to Ethan and Nayeli. "But maybe we do not know what that something is anymore." And there was no weakness in his voice, no surrender, just an acknowledgement that the ground had shifted beneath them. Ethan said nothing, because there was nothing to add to that. No argument needed, no push required. The moment was already doing the work. Nayeli stood there, quiet as ever, but something had changed in the way she held herself, not in her posture, not in her stance, but in the space around her. Like the weight she had been carrying had shifted just enough to let her breathe a little easier, even if only for a second. One of the younger riders cleared his throat, glancing toward the ridge they had come from, then back again. "If we turn back now," he said, "we are not bringing anything with us." And the words were not a complaint, not exactly, but a statement of the cost, the uncertainty of returning without the certainty they had ridden out with. Ethan looked at him, steady, unwavering. "You are bringing something," he said. "You are bringing the truth that you did not see, what you expected." And that answer did not fill the space the way a clear victory would have, but it filled it enough to give shape to what they were feeling, enough to make it real. The lead rider looked down once more, then back up, and for a long second, he said nothing at all, just sat there, weighing something that could not be measured in dollars or distance. something that had to be decided in a place no one else could reach. And then, finally, he shifted the reins, not sharply, not dramatically, just enough to turn his horse slightly away. And that small movement carried more meaning than any command he could have given. The others watched him, waiting, and when he did not correct himself, when he did not turn back, they began to follow, one by one, not in a rush, not in retreat, but in a quiet, deliberate choice to step away from what they had come to do. The dust rose again as the horses turned, not in chaos, not in urgency, but in something almost calm, and Ethan stood where he was, not watching them leave, not marking their departure, just remaining, because this was not about them anymore. Not really. It was about what remained after they were gone, the silence that followed, the space left behind. And when the last rider disappeared over the ridge, the desert felt different, not quieter, not safer, just clearer, like something that had been held tight had finally been released. And for a moment, neither Ethan nor Naeli spoke, because there are times when words only get in the way of what has already been understood. The dust settled slower after they were gone, like the land itself was taking its time returning to what it had been before, and Ethan did not move right away, not because he was unsure, but because some moments asked a man to stay still long enough to understand what had just passed through him. The weight of it, the quiet shift that did not come with noise or recognition, only with absence, and behind him, Naeli let out a breath so soft it almost disappeared into the wind, the kind of breath that had been held longer than it should have been, longer than was safe. And when he finally turned to look at her, she was no longer holding herself the same way, not tense, not braced for what might come next, just standing, as if the ground beneath her had stopped shifting for the first time in days. "They will come back," she said after a moment, not as a warning, not as fear, just a simple truth placed between them like everything else she had said. And Ethan nodded slightly, because he knew that too, knew that moments like this did not end things. They only changed the direction they would take when they returned. "Maybe," he replied, "but not the same way." And there was something in his voice that carried more than the words themselves, something that suggested what had just happened would not leave those men unchanged, even if they tried to pretend otherwise. Naeli studied him for a second, her eyes searching not for answers, but for something else, something quieter. "You stood when you did not have to," she said, and it was not gratitude, not exactly. It was recognition, the kind that does not ask for anything in return. Ethan shifted his weight slightly, the beads still resting in his hand, their surface warm now from the sun and from his grip. "I have walked away before," he said, and the words came out slower then. The others, like they carried something behind them, something not yet spoken, did not make anything better, he added, and that was all. No explanation, no story to follow it, just a piece of truth set down between them. Naeli nodded once, like she understood more than he had said, like she had seen that kind of choice before in others, in herself, and the silence that followed was different from the ones before, not tense, not uncertain, just quiet, like two people sharing the same space. Without needing to fill it, the wind moved again, softer now, carrying a faint sound from far off, not hoofbeats this time, just the distant call of something alive in the open land. A reminder that the world continued whether or not anyone understood it. Ethan looked down at the beads in his hand, turning them once more, then held them out toward her, not as an offering, not as something owed, just returning what was hers. And she took them without hesitation, her fingers closing around them, with a familiarity that made it clear they belonged there, not in his hand, not in anyone else's. "You saw something in those," she said, and it was not a question, just a statement. And Ethan gave a small nod. "Enough to know the story did not fit," he replied, and that was as far as he went, because this was not about proving anything, not anymore. Naeli looked out toward the ridge where the riders had disappeared, her gaze steady, thoughtful. "They will carry that with them now," she said, almost to herself, and there was something in her tone that suggested she understood the weight of that, the way a single moment could follow a man longer than he expected. Ethan followed her gaze briefly, then looked back at her. "So will you," he said, and for the first time since he had met her, there was the faintest shift in her expression, not quite a smile, but something close, something that had not been there before, something that did not belong to fear or exhaustion. I already was, she said, lifting the bead slightly. And in that small motion, in that quiet acknowledgement, something passed between them that did not need to be named, not trust, not yet, but the beginning of something that might become it, if given time, if given space. Ethan glanced back toward his horse, standing a short distance away, calm now, as if it too had felt the shift in the air, and for a moment, he considered what came next, the road ahead, the distance between where he was and where he had been headed before this moment changed everything. And it no longer felt like the same road, no longer felt like something he could return to without carrying this with him, without letting it change something he had not planned to change. Where will you go? He asked, and the question was simple, but it carried more than direction, more than distance. Nayeli looked out across the land, the wide stretch of desert that did not offer easy answers to anyone. Somewhere the story has not reached yet, she said, and there was a quiet determination in it, not to hide, not to disappear, but to move forward in a way that did not let the past decide everything. Ethan nodded slowly, understanding that more than he expected to, and for a moment, they stood there, two people from worlds that were not supposed to meet like this, not supposed to share this kind of stillness. And yet here they were, not divided by the distance between them, but connected by something that had been built in silence, in choice, in the refusal to follow a story that did not feel true. And when the wind shifted once more, carrying the first hint of evening into the air, it did not feel like an ending, not even close. It felt like something just beginning, quiet, uncertain, but real enough to follow wherever it chose to lead. The light began to shift in a way only the desert could manage, slow and almost unnoticeable at first. Then suddenly everything carried a different weight, shadows stretching longer. Across the ground, colors softening into something quieter, and Ethan could feel it settle into his chest, that sense that whatever had just passed between them did not belong to the harsh brightness of midday. It belonged to this hour, this slower time when the world stopped demanding answers and allowed questions to exist without urgency. Nayeli turned slightly, not away from him, not fully toward the horizon either, just enough that her profile caught the fading light, and for a moment, she looked less like the figure from the stories and more like something real, something grounded, something that had always been there beneath everything people had decided about her. You should not stay here long, she said, and there was no warning in it, no fear, just an understanding of how things moved out here, how word traveled faster than a man could ride if it needed to. Ethan followed her gaze out across the open land, where the ridge now sat quiet and empty, giving no sign of what had passed over it not long ago. I was not planning to, he replied, and that was true in a way, but it did not feel complete, because what he had planned before no longer felt like something he could return to without thinking about what had changed. Nayeli nodded once, then looked down at the beads in her hand, turning them slowly, her fingers tracing the edges like she was reading something written into them, something only she could fully understand. These belong to a child, she said after a moment, and her voice carried a different weight now, softer, but deeper. I did not know their name, she added, only that they were not meant to be part of any of this. And Ethan listened, not interrupting, not asking, because there was something in the way she spoke that asked for space, not response. I found them near the edge of the creek, she continued, where the water bends and the ground is soft enough to keep footprints longer than it should, and that detail settled into Ethan's mind, quiet but important, because it was not something someone would invent. It was something someone would remember, something that stayed because it mattered. There were tracks, she said, but not the kind they described in town. And she glanced up at him then, just briefly. They were too ordered, she finished, and Ethan felt that word land in a place he had not expected. Ordered, not scattered, not panicked, not what a story of chaos would leave behind, but something deliberate, something planned, and it shifted the shape of what he had already begun to question. You followed them, he said, not asking, just placing the thought where it belonged, and she gave a small nod. For a while, she answered, until they disappeared where the ground turned hard, and that was enough to paint a picture without needing to fill in every line, enough to understand that whatever had happened at Red Creek had not been what people wanted to believe, The wind carried a cooler edge now, brushing past them in a way that felt almost like a reminder. That time was moving whether they chose to move with it or not. Ethan shifted slightly, his boots pressing into the dirt as he considered what she had said, what it meant, not just for her, but for everything that would follow if that truth ever reached the places that had already decided otherwise. If they planned it, he said slowly. Then they planned what came after too. And Nayeli looked at him again, her eyes steady. Yes, she said. They planned who would be blamed. And there was no anger in it. No bitterness, just clarity, and somehow that made it heavier, because it meant she had already accepted that part of it, had already carried that weight before he ever arrived. Ethan let out a slow breath, his gaze moving across the horizon again, seeing it differently now, not as empty land, but as something that held more than it showed, something that could carry truth and hide it at the same time. Then walking away today does not end it, he said, and it was not doubt, just recognition. Nayeli shook her head slightly. No, she replied, but it changes who will question it next time. And that answer settled into him in a way that felt both simple and complicated at once, because it was not about stopping something entirely. It was about shifting it, about creating space where none had existed before, the kind of change that did not announce itself but still mattered. Ethan looked at her for a long second, seeing her not as someone caught in a story, but as someone who understood it in a way most people never would. You carry this alone, he said, and it was not a question, and she met his gaze without hesitation. Not alone, she said, lifting the bead slightly again. Never alone. And there was something in that, something that spoke of memory, of connection, of things that did not disappear even when people tried to forget them, and Ethan nodded once, not fully understanding, but respecting it all the same. The last of the lights stretched across the land now, turning everything softer, quieter, and in that moment, the distance between them felt smaller than it had been when they first stood here, not because they had moved closer, but because something else had shifted, something that could not be measured in steps or space. If you go where the story has not reached, Ethan said, his voice low, almost thoughtful, it will follow eventually. And Nayeli gave the faintest hint of that almost smile again. Stories always do, she replied, but so does truth. And the way she said it did not sound like hope, did not sound like doubt either. It sounded like something she had already seen happen, something she believed not because she wanted to, but because she had no reason not to. And as the sun dipped lower, leaving them in the quiet space between day and night, it became clear that whatever path they chose next would not erase what had happened here. It would carry it forward, in ways neither of them could fully see yet, but could both feel settling into place, steady, undeniable, and waiting. The last edge of sunlight slipped behind the horizon without ceremony, leaving the land in that quiet gray where shapes softened and distance felt longer than it was. And Ethan did not reach for his horse right away, did not break the stillness that had settled between them, because something in this moment asked to be held just a little longer, like a breath taken before a road begins. And Nayeli stood beside him, not close, not distant, simply there, her presence no longer something uncertain or fragile, but something steady, something that had chosen to remain even when leaving would have been easier. The wind cooled further, brushing past them with a gentler touch now, carrying the scent of evening and the faint promise of night settling in. When they returned, Ethan said quietly, his voice lower than before, shaped by the weight of everything they had uncovered. They will bring more than questions, and it was not a warning, not fear, just the kind of understanding that comes from knowing how men react when certainty is taken from them. Nayeli nodded once, her gaze still fixed on the horizon where the riders had disappeared. Yes, she said, they will want something solid again, and that word lingered, solid, like something that could not be shaken, something that could be held and pointed to and believed without hesitation. And if they do not find it, Ethan added, they will try to make it. And there was no accusation in his voice, only recognition, because he had seen that before, had lived close enough to it to know how easily truth could be shaped into something else when people needed it to be. Nayeli turned slightly then, facing him more directly, and for the first time, there was something different in her expression, not uncertainty, not resignation, but a quiet resolve that had been there all along, simply waiting for the right moment to surface. Then we do not let them decide it alone, she said. And the way she spoke those words carried no force, no demand, just a calm certainty that made them harder to ignore than anything louder ever could. Ethan studied her for a moment, seeing not just the woman standing in front of him, but everything that had brought her here, everything she had carried without asking anyone else to help. And something in him shifted again, not in a way that surprised him this time, but in a way that felt inevitable, like a path he had already stepped onto without realizing it. You are not just going somewhere the story has not reached, he said slowly. You are going back to where it started. And she held his gaze, steady, unflinching. Yes, she answered, and that single word carried more weight than anything she had said before, because it was not about escape, not about distance. It was about facing something that had already been decided without her, something that needed to be seen clearly if it was ever going to change. Ethan exhaled slowly, his eyes moving once more across the darkening land, imagining the stretch of miles between here and Red Creek, the ground that would hold whatever answers were still waiting there. That is a long ride, he said, and it was not doubt, just truth. And Nayeli gave a small nod. It always was, she replied, and there was something in that answer that suggested she had already accepted the cost of it long before this moment. The silence returned again, but it was not empty. It was filled with the shape of what came next, the unspoken understanding that neither of them would leave this place unchanged, that whatever path they chose would carry the weight of what had happened here. Ethan glanced toward his horse, then back at her, and for a brief second, the old instinct surfaced, the one that told him to keep moving, to stay out of things that did not belong to him, to let the world sort itself out the way it always had. But that instinct did not hold the same weight it once did, not after today, not after standing in front of something that did not match the story he had been given and choosing not to walk away from it. If I ride with you, he said, his voice even, measured, this does not stay simple. And it was not a warning, not to her, but to himself, a recognition of what that choice would mean. Nayeli did not answer immediately. She looked at him in a way that did not measure or judge, just saw. It was never simple, she said, and there was no argument in it. No push, just truth, and that was enough to settle whatever hesitation remained. Ethan gave a small nod, almost to himself, then reached for the reins of his horse, his movements unhurried, deliberate, like each step was part of something already decided. And as he swung into the saddle, the leather creaking softly under his weight, he looked down at her once more, not as someone separate from his path, but as part of it now. Then we find out what really happened, he said, and it was not a promise. Not in the way people usually make them. It was something steadier, something grounded in action rather than words. Nayeli held his gaze for a moment, then gave a single nod, the bead still resting in her hand, catching the last trace of light before the darkness settled fully around them. And without another word, she turned, stepping forward into the open land, not looking back, not hesitating, and Ethan followed, guiding his horse beside her, the two of them moving into the deepening night, not away from the story that had been written about them, but toward the place where it could finally be seen for what it was. And in that quiet beginning, under a sky that held more questions than answers, something took shape between them that did not need to be named yet, something that would grow with every mile they chose to ride together. The night did not fall all at once. It gathered slowly around them, layer by layer, until the last trace of light disappeared and the desert became a place of sound instead of sight. The soft rhythm of hooves against packed earth, the whisper of wind moving through dry grass, the quiet breath of two people moving forward without needing to speak. And Ethan kept his horse at an easy pace beside Nayeli, not ahead, not behind, just enough to match her steps, because this was not a chase, not a pursuit. It was something steadier than that, something that asked for patience instead of urgency. The sky above them stretched wide and clear, filled with stars that did not flicker, did not shift, constant in a way the land below never was. And for a while, neither of them said anything, because there are moments when words would only make things smaller than they are, and this was not a moment meant to be reduced. Nayeli walked with a rhythm that did not falter, her steps measured, deliberate, like she knew this path not by memory, but by instinct. like the land itself was something she listened to rather than something she crossed, and Ethan noticed it without commenting. The way she adjusted her direction slightly without looking. The way she avoided the loose stones that would have turned under his boots. The way she moved as if she belonged here in a way he never fully had. "You have been this way before," he said eventually, his voice quiet enough not to disturb the space between them, and she nodded once, not breaking her stride. "Long ago," she replied, and there was something in the way she said it that suggested time did not hold the same shape for her as it did for others, not measured in years, but in moments that stayed and moments that passed. Ethan glanced ahead into the darkness, seeing only the faint outline of land rising and falling. "Red Creek," he said, not as a question, and she gave a small nod again. "Yes," she answered, and that single word carried them both forward a little further, because now the direction was not just understood, it was shared. The wind shifted again, carrying a cooler edge that brushed against his face, and Ethan pulled his coat slightly tighter without thinking, his eyes adjusting slowly to the dark, picking up what little detail the night allowed. And still she moved without hesitation, without pause, as if the darkness was not something to overcome, but something to move through. "Why did you go back there?" he asked after a while, and the question did not come from doubt, but from something else, something closer to understanding. And Nayeli slowed her pace just slightly, not stopping, just enough that her answer would not be lost in the sound of their movement. "Because the story was wrong," she said, and there was no hesitation in it, no uncertainty, just a simple truth that had guided her steps long before he joined her. "And you knew that?" Ethan said, and she shook her head gently. "No," she replied. "I knew it did not feel right." And that distinction settled into him, because it was not about certainty, not at first. It was about something quieter, something that told you to look again even when everyone else had already looked away. "So you followed it anyway," he said, and she nodded. "Yes," and that was enough. Enough to understand that this path they were on now had started before he arrived, that he had stepped into something already in motion, something that would have continued whether he chose to be part of it or not. The ground beneath them shifted slightly, the dirt giving way to patches of harder earth, and Ethan adjusted his grip on the reins without thinking, his horse stepping carefully now, more deliberate with each movement. And still Nayeli did not slow, did not hesitate, her steps sure even in the changing terrain, and there was something in that spoke louder than anything she could say, something that told him she had already walked through uncertainty and come out the other side with something steadier than fear. "When we get there," he said after a moment, "what are you looking for?" And the question carried more than curiosity. It carried the weight of what they were choosing to face. Nayeli lifted her hand slightly, the beads catching a faint trace of starlight as they moved. "Not what they say happened," she answered. "What was left behind." And Ethan felt that settle into place, because what is left behind does not lie, not the way people do, not the way stories can. It simply remains, waiting for someone willing to see it clearly. "And if it is not enough?" he asked, and this time there was a hint of something beneath his voice, not doubt, but the recognition that truth does not always come in a way that can be carried easily. Nayeli slowed again, just for a second, then continued, her voice steady when she spoke. "Then we keep looking," she said, and there was no frustration in it, no impatience, just a quiet acceptance that some things take longer than they should, that some truths do not reveal themselves all at once, and that was enough for him. Enough to quiet whatever questions remained, because this was not about finding an answer quickly, it was about finding the right one, no matter how long it took. The night deepened around them, the stars stretching wider across the sky, and their path continued forward, step by step, mile by mile, not marked by urgency, not driven by fear, but by something steadier, something that had taken shape in the quiet space between them earlier that day. And as they moved further into the dark, toward a place where a story had been written without them, it became clear that what they were chasing was not just the truth of what had happened, but something else entirely, something that had been missing long before they ever set foot on this road, something that could only be found by those willing to walk into the unknown without turning away. The hours passed without being counted, measured only by the slow shift of the sky above them as the stars moved in their quiet patterns, and Ethan felt the weight of distance not in miles, but in the way the land began to change beneath them, subtle at first, then more certain, the ground losing some of its loose edge, becoming firmer, flatter, like it had been walked more often than the empty stretches behind them. And Naeli slowed just slightly, not because she was tired, but because something in the air had changed, something that asked for attention, for care. "We are close," she said, her voice low but clear, and Ethan nodded, though he could not yet see what she felt, not the way she did, but he trusted the shift in her steps, the way her movements became more deliberate, more aware, like every inch of ground mattered now. The wind moved differently here too, carrying a faint trace of moisture, not enough to feel, but enough to smell if you knew what to listen for, and Ethan drew in a slow breath, recognizing it. "Water, distant but present. The creek bends ahead," Naeli said, confirming what he had begun to sense, and they moved forward in silence after that, not out of caution, but out of respect for the place they were approaching, because some places held more than land. They held memory, and memory had a way of asking for quiet. The first sign came not as a sight, but as a sound, the faintest whisper of water moving over stone, steady and low, and Ethan felt something in his chest tighten, not from fear, but from the understanding that they had reached the edge of something that had already changed lives before either of them had stepped into it. Naeli stopped then, just short of the rise where the land dipped toward the creek, and she did not step forward right away. She stood there, listening, feeling, as if the ground itself might speak if she gave it enough time. Ethan remained where he was, not moving past her, not breaking the moment, because he understood now that this was not a place to rush into, not a place to claim with action, but something to enter carefully, deliberately. After a long moment, Naeli stepped forward, her foot finding the ground with quiet certainty, and Ethan followed, guiding his horse slowly behind her, the slope gentle but enough to shift their view as they moved down toward the water. And then it was there, Red Creek, not wide, not deep, but steady, its surface catching what little light remained from the stars above, reflecting it in broken lines across the moving water, and for a moment, it looked like any other place, quiet, untouched, but that was the way of things out here. What had happened did not leave marks that shouted, it left traces that waited, the kind that only revealed themselves if you were willing to look long enough. Naeli moved closer to the edge, her steps slowing further, her gaze sweeping the ground not in wide arcs, but in small, precise movements, taking in details Ethan would have missed entirely, and he dismounted then, letting the reins rest loosely in his hand as he stepped onto the firmer ground near the water, and at first, he saw nothing, just dirt, just stone, just the edge where water met land. But then, slowly, as his eyes adjusted, as his focus sharpened, he began to see what she had meant, faint impressions in the ground, not fresh, not clear, but still there, preserved in the softer patches, where the earth had held them longer than it should have. "Here," Naeli said quietly, crouching near a stretch of ground where the marks were more defined, and Ethan moved closer, lowering himself slightly to see what she saw. And there it was, not scattered, not chaotic, but ordered, the prints aligned in a way that spoke of intention, not panic, of movement that had been controlled, not desperate. And he felt that realization settle into him with a weight that could not be ignored. "They moved together," he said, his voice low, and Naeli nodded. "Yes," she replied, her fingers hovering just above the ground, not touching, not disturbing what remained, not like a family running. She added, and that distinction mattered, because it did not match the story, did not fit the shape of what had been told. Ethan looked further along the edge, following the line of prints as far as he could see, and then he noticed something else, something that did not belong to the pattern, a break, a shift where the ground changed from soft to hard, and the marks simply stopped, not faded, not scattered, just gone. "They knew where to step," he said, and Naeli rose slowly, her gaze moving to that same point. "Yes," she answered. "They chose where the land would not remember them." And that thought carried more weight than anything else they had found, because it spoke of planning, of knowledge, of something deliberate beyond what anyone had wanted to believe. The water moved quietly beside them, unchanged, uncaring, carrying its own path forward without regard for what had happened along its edge, and Ethan stood there for a long moment, taking it in, not just the marks in the ground, but what they meant, what they suggested, what they revealed about a story that had been built on something else entirely. "This is not enough," he said finally, not in frustration, not in doubt, just in recognition that truth rarely comes in a single piece. Naeli nodded, her expression steady. "No," she replied. "But it is where it begins." And the way she said it made it clear that this place was not the answer, but the first step toward it. And as the night settled fully around them, wrapping the creek and the land in quiet darkness, it became clear that what they had found here would not end anything. It would only lead them deeper into something that had been hidden long before they ever chose to look for it. The creek did not change, but the way they stood beside it did, as if the ground beneath them had begun to reveal more than it had a moment ago, not by shifting, not by speaking, but by allowing them to see what had always been there, waiting beneath assumption. And Ethan moved a few steps further along the edge, his eyes tracing the place where the prints had vanished, that clean break where the soft earth gave way to stone, and he crouched there, not touching, just looking, letting his eyes adjust to the pattern of absence instead of presence. Because sometimes what was missing said more than what remained. "They did not just disappear," he said quietly, more to the ground than to Naeli, and she stepped closer, standing just behind him, her shadow blending with his in the low light. "No," she replied. "They chose where to leave nothing behind." And that thought settled deeper now, because it was no longer a suggestion. It was a pattern, something repeated, something intentional. Ethan lifted his gaze slightly, scanning the harder ground beyond, and though there were no clear marks, there were small signs, subtle shifts in the surface, the kind that would go unnoticed by anyone not looking for them. A faint scuff where a boot had turned just slightly, a stone pressed deeper than it should have been, and he followed those signs slowly, step by careful step, not moving far, just enough to see the direction they pointed. And it was not toward Apache land, not toward the hills that had been named in town with certainty, but away from them, angling instead toward the open flats where ranch trails ran long and quiet, where men moved without being seen if they chose their path well. "This way," he said, rising slowly, his voice still low, and Naeli followed his line of sight, her eyes narrowing just slightly as she took in the same details, the same subtle shift in direction, and she nodded once, not surprised, not uncertain, just confirming what she had already begun to understand. "They turned the story before anyone saw it," she said, and the words carried a quiet weight, because they did not accuse, they revealed, and that made them harder to deny. Ethan exhaled slowly, the air leaving his chest like something settling into place. "They needed it to point somewhere," he said, "and they chose a place people would not question." And that was the part that lingered, not just the act itself, but the choice behind it, the understanding of how belief worked out here, how quickly it could be shaped when fear was involved. Naeli stepped forward then, moving along the line Ethan had traced, her steps light but certain, and she crouched again a few feet ahead, her fingers hovering above another small mark, barely visible, but enough. "Here," she said, and Ethan joined her, lowering himself again. And this time he saw it clearly, not a full print, not a track, but a pattern in the dust, a curve that did not belong to the natural shape of the ground, something pressed and lifted in a way that spoke of weight, of movement. And it confirmed what they were beginning to see, that this path had been chosen carefully, not left to chance. "They knew how to hide," he said, and Naeli nodded. "Yes," she replied, "but not from everything." And there was something in that, something that suggested the land remembered more than they expected, that even careful steps left traces if someone was willing to look closely enough. The water moved beside them, steady, unchanged, reflecting the stars above in broken lines that shifted with every small current. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, because the shape of what they were uncovering was becoming clearer, not in full, not yet, but enough to change what came next. Ethan rose again, his gaze following the direction of the hidden trail as far as the darkness would allow, and he felt that same quiet certainty settle into him, the kind that did not come from knowing everything, but from knowing enough to move forward. "This does not end at the creek," he said, and it was not a question. Naeli stood beside him now, her posture steady, her gaze aligned with his. "No," she answered, This is where it was meant to be forgotten, and the weight of that lingered, because it meant everything beyond this point had been built on that forgetting, on that absence of truth, and now they stood at the edge of it, not with answers, but with direction, and that was enough, enough to take the next step, enough to continue. Ethan turned slightly, looking back once toward the water, toward the place where the story had begun to unravel, and then forward again, toward the path that had been hidden in plain sight, and without another word, he stepped onto it, not rushing, not forcing anything, just moving with the same quiet certainty that had carried them this far. And Nayeli followed, her steps falling into rhythm. Beside his, the beads still in her hand, their surface catching what little light remained, a small, steady reminder of why they were here. And as they moved away from the creek, deeper into the night and toward a truth that had been carefully buried, the silence between them no longer felt like emptiness. It felt like understanding, something shared without needing to be spoken, something that would carry them forward through whatever came next. The trail did not reveal itself all at once. It unfolded slowly beneath their steps, like something that had waited long enough to be seen and no longer needed to hide. And Ethan followed it without rushing, his eyes adjusting to the faint disturbances in the ground, the subtle shifts that pointed forward through the darkness. And Nayeli moved beside him with the same steady rhythm, her presence no longer something separate from his path, but woven into it, quiet and certain. And as they walked, the land began to change again, the open flats giving way to a stretch of low brush and scattered posts, the kind used to mark boundaries no one questioned once they were set. And Ethan slowed slightly, his gaze lifting from the ground to the shapes ahead, wooden markers spaced out in a line that stretched farther than the eye could follow in the dark. Ranch. Land, he said, not as a question, and Nayeli nodded once, her eyes fixed on the same direction. Yes, she replied, and there was no surprise in her voice, only confirmation, like this was always where the path had been leading. Ethan took a slow breath, the weight of it settling in his chest, not heavy, not overwhelming, just clear, because this was not about a story anymore, not about something distant or uncertain. This was something real, something that belonged to men who lived and worked, and made choices that others carried the cost of. And he stepped forward again, crossing the invisible line where open land became something owned, something claimed, and the ground beneath his boots felt no different, but the meaning of it did. Nayeli followed without hesitation, her steps just as steady, just as certain, and together they moved deeper into the marked land, the faint outline of a structure beginning to take shape in the distance. Not large, not imposing, but enough to suggest presence, enough to confirm that this was not an empty place. The trail led straight toward it, not bending, not breaking, and that told Ethan more than anything else they had seen so far, because hidden paths do not lead to empty ground. They lead to purpose, to something waiting at the end. They did not just pass through, he said quietly, and Nayeli's voice came just as steady beside him. No, she replied. They returned, and that single word shifted everything, because it meant this was not a one-time act, not a moment of chaos that had been misunderstood. It was something planned, something connected to a place that still stood, still existed, and the air felt different here, not heavier, not tense, just aware, like the land itself held the memory of what had moved across it. Ethan slowed again as they neared the edge of the structure's outline, his horse stepping quietly behind him, and he could make out more now, a fence line, a gate left slightly open, a path worn into the ground that matched the direction they had followed, and he stopped just short of it, not because he was unsure, but because this moment asked for stillness, the kind that comes before something is understood fully. Nayeli stood beside him, her gaze fixed ahead, her hand still holding the beads, and for a moment, neither of them moved, because what lay in front of them was no longer a question of where. It was a question of what would be done with what they had found. This is where it leads, Ethan said, his voice low, and Nayeli nodded once. Yes, she answered, and there was something in her tone that carried both the end of one search and the beginning of another, because finding the place was not the same as revealing the truth. It was only the point where it could no longer be ignored. The wind moved softly through the posts, brushing against the wood in a way that made no sound, and Ethan felt that same quiet clarity settle into him again. The kind that does not come from certainty, but from alignment, from standing in a place where what you see matches what you feel. And he stepped forward, just one step, crossing fully into the space that had been hidden behind a story not meant to be questioned. And Nayeli moved with him, not behind, not ahead, but beside. And in that single movement, something completed itself, not the journey, not the truth, but the choice that had brought them here. The refusal to accept what had been handed to them without looking deeper, the willingness to stand in something uncertain until it became clear, and they did not speak again, not because there was nothing left to say, but because what needed to be understood no longer required words. It existed in the ground beneath their feet, in the path that had led them here, in the quiet. Agreement between them that neither of them would turn away now. And as the night settled fully around the ranch, holding it in the same stillness that had followed them from the desert, the story that had once seemed so certain began to unravel completely, not with noise, not with confrontation, but with the simple, undeniable presence of truth standing where it had always been, waiting for someone to see it. And in that quiet, in that still moment where everything finally aligned, it became clear that justice did not arrive with force, it arrived with understanding, carried by those willing to walk far enough to find it and strong enough to stand still when they did.